The last lecture was devoted to the biological characteristics of the species Homo sapiens. We considered all this from the standpoint of the theory of governance, interpreting human society as a supersystem. A supersystem is a plurality of elements, every one of which is capable of self-governance on the basis of the information and algorithmics that the element has in its memory. The element is able to perceive information from the external environment and is able to pass information into the external environment. Well, and accordingly, on this basis, some processes can flow in the supersystem. If we analyze the character of the interaction of the supersystem with the environment, then, in a general consideration, it turns out that in order to introduce the supersystem into the environment, the supersystem must have some minimum sufficient information-algorithmic support, which ensures the stability of the supersystem in the environment. If this is not the case, then the environment destroys the supersystem. It is only a matter of time. If this is the case, and there is only this, then there is no development, and the supersystem cannot increase its functional operability in interaction with the environment if there is only this fundamental component of information-algorithmic support, which is invariable throughout the entire process of interaction between the supersystem and the environment. In order for the supersystem to be able to develop, to be able to increase its effectiveness in interaction with the environment, a variable part is required. If we approach the consideration of the life of humanity from these standpoints, then the fundamental component is innate instincts and unconditioned, that is, also innate, reflexes, and the adaptational part is the whole culture. Because if we consider culture from the standpoint of the theory of governance, then culture is an information-algorithmic system. The term information-algorithmic system in relation to culture means that culture carries in itself a certain set of objectives and a certain set of methods and ways to achieve each of the objectives. With this approach, cultures are not interchangeable, because they may not coincide with each other in terms of the set of objectives, in characteristics, and in terms of the method of achieving those objectives that are common to them. The simplest example is national cuisine. The task is one, to support human physiology. But in every national culture, its own cuisine solves this in different ways. The same objectives that are present in one culture may be absent in another. And therefore, a person born in a certain culture, while remaining within the framework of his culture, will never be able to solve those tasks that are easily and simply solved by representatives of other cultures. In this regard, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is not a question of the full-fledgedness or non-full-fledgedness of those peoples, but this is an indication that as a result of their historical development, they generated different cultures that carry different sets of objectives and different methods of achieving them. Many problems of what is now called multiculturalism in the West are connected with this circumstance. If cultures, as information-algorithmic systems, are different, then in a multicultural society, the absence of certain objectives and algorithms for achieving them in one culture, and the presence in another in the social unification of labor, manifests itself as an ethnic division of labor. Further, in market price forming, when professionalism is also a product, situations arise when some are doomed to always live on minimum wages, while others have the opportunity to work in any professions or have some kind of excess income. And on the principles of the liberal bourgeois multiculturalism, these European problems created in the second half of the 20th century are not being solved. If culture is an information-algorithmic system, if culture is variable, then there arises the question on the typology of cultures. The question on the typology of cultures is the question on the classificational attributes, that is, what we see in a culture, what attributes characterize its specificities, and how we will build a hierarchy of these attributes. This, however, is also a subjective question, but one must not forget that there exist objective laws. Objective laws manifest themselves in the fact that if we violate them, then ignorance of objective laws does not save us from the negative consequences of their violation. Therefore, if we build a typology of cultures, and in addition, we are mistaken in the hierarchy of classificational attributes, then life will correct us, in the sense that those who are not mistaken, they will have competitive advantages in relation to us, and accordingly, we will be coming up with problems connected precisely with the interaction of the carriers of other cultures, who are less mistaken, or not mistaken at all, setting a hierarchy of typological attributes. If, nevertheless, we correlate with the types of psyche structure, let me remind you, if everything is subordinated to instincts, then the structure of the information-algorithmic psyche is no different from the structure of the psyche of an animal. If the conflict of instincts and cultural norms is resolved in favor of the norms of the formed culture, then this is no different from the psyche type of zombies. Maybe in a few more years or decades, both science and technology will be able to create an anthropomorphic robot, a replacement of a chip, which will transfer it from a state of functioning in one culture into a state of functioning in another culture. And you will not be able to distinguish it until it comes to cutting and anatomy, or some situation arises, actions for which the software of this robot is not provided. With a person, the situation is exactly the same. If creative potential is not developed and is not in demand, or is blocked by some means, then when faced with a situation for which he does not have a ready-made recipe, he falls into a stupor, and the situation harms him, up to destruction. Therefore, the question on creative potential is important. And if in situations where there are no ready-made recipes, creative potential manifests itself, then this is no longer a zombie. But again, this is still not quite a human, because creative potential, in this version of consideration, is free from any nravious ethical restrictions. That is, the concepts of dobro and evil are not inherent in the person, and actually the principle is as follows. If some objective nraviousness inherent in the person has formed, he acts according to the following principle. Dobro, for him, is everything that he does, and who does not agree with this, then either show that you are stronger, and he will subordinate to you, or accept him as he is with all his tricks that he ascribes to dobro and truth in the last instance. This is the demonic type of psyche structure. But the human type of psyche structure is when the creative potential is subordinated to the dictatorship of Sovest. Moreover, I say once again that in Russian literature written before 1917, Sovest is interpreted as the innate religious feeling, thanks to which a person unmistakably distinguishes dobro from evil in the concretics of the development of life situations with which he interacts. In the literature written in the era of materialistic atheism, Sovest is interpreted as a skill that appears in a person as a result of upbringing, and thus such an understanding of Sovest replaces the concept of honor, which was before 1917. Because honor was understood as loyalty to principles, and the principles could arise not from Sovest, but from the cultural norms that had formed in a particular society. So if we look at the dueling culture, then we can see that it completely contradicted the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," which all the Orthodox were supposed to follow. However, the dueling culture existed, and a refusal to follow its norms was dishonorable, even if the refusal was according to one's own Sovest. So honor and Sovest are not the same things. But the difference between shame and Sovest acts preemptively in relation to a solution of a situation, and shame acts after we ignore the voice of Sovest, or it remains silent due to the peculiarity of our upbringing. So we mess up, and then we become ashamed. If we correlate with this, the typologization of culture is quite simple. The first question is about the relation towards creative potential. Cultures can be of different types. Variant 1. Creative potential is suppressed purpose-orientedly, maybe unconsciously, but de facto it is suppressed. And therefore, the life of new generations, like a broken record, repeats the life of past generations. Nothing is renewed in society because in order for something to be renewed, manifestations of creative potential are needed. Variant 2. A neutral relation towards creative potential. To put it differently, if you have it, you can develop it, realize it, master it. It will manifest itself in your life and exert an impact on the life of society, but this is your own business. If you do not want to master and realize your own creative potential, this is also your business. Nobody will reproach you, nobody will say anything good or bad. Variant 3 is selective. It implies the suppression of creative potential in some social groups and the purpose-oriented cultivation and mastery of creative potential in other social groups. All these variants presuppose sovestlessness, either society-wide or of those who dominate over each of the types of culture. Why? Because all these variants do not presuppose that by the beginning of adolescence, everyone reaches the human type of psyche structure, so that everyone's will is subordinated to the dictatorship of his sovest. And therefore, the second classificational attribute of cultures is purely ethical questions. And the difference here is simple. Society has to be nraviously ethically homogeneous. That is, one and the same nraviousness and ethics are a norm for the head of state, for the head of an industrial enterprise or an association of enterprises, corporations, and for a simple worker, pensioner, and so on. Whatever a person does, ethics and nraviousness have to be actually the same, and everyone's sovest has to manifest itself. Sovest has to manifest itself in life, factually in actions, but not declaratively. Otherwise, a hierarchy of individuals, a hierarchy of social groups is built, and for every social group, culture prescribes its own nraviousness and ethics forbidden to others. So, here are two classificational attributes that define the face of any culture. The first is the relation towards creative potential, and the second is about whether a society should be nraviously ethically homogeneous, or in this society some are more equal than others, this is a form of liberal lexicon, or a shamelessly hierarchical system of people, a caste system, is established, where social status is for the most part inherited via ancestral lines. To a lesser extent, it is inherited through introduction into these or those castes or stratas when there are open vacancies in them. Vacancies can be opened on account of the destruction of past representatives, or on account of the fact that there exists economic progress, and per person, the volume of production and accordingly the volume of consumption increase. If we correlate with this typology, then everything else is minor historical details. Further, the question arises on how this whole thing correlates with the biological basis of civilization. That is, with innate reflexes and instincts, the genetic program, and everything else that we discussed in the previous lecture. This correlates in such a way that the prospects for the current global civilization, while maintaining the same nraviousness and ethics, are sad. Why? Because the direction of biology, known as ethology, has revealed that there are objective laws in the biosphere. Their essence boils down to the fact that high innate morality is inherent in strongly equipped species. The essence is that their instinctive programs are such that when it comes to fights in interspecific competition for a female, for a place in the sun, strikes that can cripple or kill a competing specimen are never delivered. It all comes down to the demonstration of frightening poses, making frightening sounds. In rare cases, it comes down to strikes that are obviously not dangerous. And the fight ends with the fact that a specimen, admitting its defeat, tucking the tail, demonstrating a pose of submission, or demonstrating submission in another way, leaves the territory and the question is closed for a long time, at least until the next mating season when fights for the territory occur, and a different combination of mating of males and females may occur. This is not the case with weakly equipped species. Since they cannot cripple each other, everything among them is possible. The situation is aggravated by the fact that if the weakly equipped species do not live by themselves, but in packs, because intraspecific competition leads to the fact that the herd pack should form as a single, functional whole in interaction with the biocenoses, and the effectiveness of this herd pack, first of all in nutrition and defense from others, should be as effective as possible. The instincts of herd pack worthy behavior are such that as a result, a hierarchy of specimens is built. The hierarchy of specimens does not imply common ethics one for all. Man, leaving the biosphere into civilization, inherits all these algorithms of herd pack behavior, weakly equipped in biological terms species. And everything flows from this. Everything that society calls scoundrelism, collective persecution of losers, putting resent on those who are not involved, and so on and so forth. Another factor comes into play here. creative potential generates the technosphere and magic. Magic is a special question because from the point of view of materialistic science, it allegedly does not exist. But if we approach the analysis of the life of a person from the standpoint of only physics, then a person consists of atoms of an organism. Atoms form molecules. Molecules form cell tissues. As we rise from the level of the atom to the level of the organism, the number of degrees of freedom increases. Oscillations are possible for each degree of freedom. And as a result, when all this begins to oscillate, then some oscillations into the environment occur. If the environment has something that can respond, then it will respond and change its state or mode of functioning. Therefore, since a person is part of the world, his organism, and he is not something exceptional in nature, opposed to the world, then magic is the physics that we are not taught at school. Some use it, some do not use it, and reject its existence. And others affirm that it does not exist, in order to maintain their own monopoly on such activity. Again, this is not a question of whether it is good or bad, but a question of the fact that it exists in history. Well, further on, it turns out that the prospects are sad, because by developing the technosphere and wielding some magic, man ceases to be a weakly equipped species. But if nraviousness and ethics are preserved, taken from the biosphere, based on a weak innate morality, that is, based on the herd-pack instincts of the herd-pack monkey, then all these super-powerful weapons in the next era begin to seem primitive. New weapons are even more powerful, and they open up the possibility of destroying the entire planet in the course of clarifying the interrelationship between two packs carrying the same culture or different cultures. Therefore, the question on culture as an information-algorithmic system is really a key question in order to understand how to solve problems inherited from the past, and how to build the future without creating new problems. Because this conflict between weak innate morality, refracting through the culture of interrelationships with the technosphere, and culturally conditioned, superstructural in relation to innate morality, ethics, really explains a lot in our life, in our prospects, and in the historical past of our country and other countries, and humanity as a whole. It is necessary to build culture as an information-algorithmic system creatively, taking care that cultural, superstructural elements correspond to the genetic program of development of the organism of man, and that the conflict between innate weak morality and sovest given to a person is successfully resolved by the beginning of adolescence, so that, further on, creative potential and willpower will be subordinated to sovest. And then culture, as an information-algorithmic system, will be purpose-consonantly rebuilt towards the type, in which the creative potential of everyone guaranteedly develops, and society is obviously ethically homogeneous. This is the only opportunity that allows one to eliminate all intrasocial conflicts and eliminate the possibility of the conflict of the civilization biosphere. After this, new possibilities should open up, about which we now cannot even presuppose. All cultures have some skills in the use of various kinds of psychotropics. Psychotropics are heterogeneous. There are those that cause a persistent biochemical dependence even after a single use. There are those that cause a persistent biochemical dependence after repeated use. There are those that cause a biochemical dependence among some people, and among others they do not cause a biochemical dependence. There are those psychotropics that do not cause a biochemical dependence. The common thing of all psychotropics is that under their impact, the physiology of higher nervous activity changes, and the macrobiofield of a person moves away from the genetically programmed for him norm. On account of the fact that the biofield moves away from the genetically programmed norm, some possibilities of world perception, closed in the usual state, open up, as well as the also usually closed possibilities of impacting the world in these states. Humanity has two groups of subcultures that somehow realize these possibilities. The first one is shamanism. Shamanism in each natural geographic environment is unique, because in one place mushrooms are used for this, in another place some berries, in a third place leaves. If certain knowledge accompanies this, then the result of a change in the state under the impact of psychotropics is expressed in the fact that the shaman can do something that others cannot. If there is no knowledge, Then we have either an organism crippled by poisonous plants, or some kind of drugs, or we have a drug addict. The second one is all types of yoga. There is not one type of yoga, there are many types of yoga. Yoga can be likened to psychological hacking. In other words, if we draw analogies with a computer, that is, an operating system, there are some programs, they may have some possibilities hidden from the user. But if the user is an advanced hacker, then he is able to hack the hidden possibilities of his own computer and other people's computers if he has access to them, either purely physically or via channels of information exchange. All types of yoga are also cultures of psychological hacking, when genetically blocked possibilities on the basis of the purpose-oriented implementation of certain psychophysiological practices open up and become available to a certain individual. But all types of yoga, although they are attractive, nonetheless they all say that it is not worth practicing them without the guidance of a guru. Why not? Because like any hacking, it is fraught with dangers, and one can bring one's own psyche into such a state that no psychiatrists or super yogis will help. In this respect, the cultures of the monotheistic Abrahamic religions are opposed to the yogic cultures. In what sense? In the sense that they all have, in one way or another, concepts of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, that is, by measure of personal development, by measure of how much a person changes himself, in order to be pravious, not for show, but in essence in all life circumstances. These very hacker possibilities that are mastered in yoga subcultures become, by the grace of the Almighty, the property of a specific individual. There is probably only one episode in written sources that points to this directly. This is in the New Testament, when someone asks Peter to teach him the magic that he himself possesses. Peter has to explain to him for a long time that he does not possess any magic, and that these are the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and accordingly, if that person behaves well, then he will have them too. Further, the question arises on how these principles, this classification of culture, is expressed in history. First of all, it is necessary to point out the fact that globalization is an objective process. That is, whether we like it or not, whether someone likes it or not, nonetheless, globalization flows. It flows outside the will of every one of us for the most part, although there is a certain minority who understand the character of globalization, and by their willpower, they are trying to more or less effectively impact it. But to make it clear that globalization is indestructible, perhaps one of the most striking examples is the well-known song in Russia, Million Scarlet Roses. It is based on a real case from the life of the artist Pirosmani and the French actress who came to Tbilisi, at that time Tiflis. The poems for the song are from Moscow. Raymond Pauls honestly admitted in one of the programs that it was based on the melody of a Latvian folk song. Latvia, Moscow, the Caucasus, everything is far away from each other. Which of them thought about globalization? But the song is really a product of globalization. Therefore, it turns out that if someone does not like it, then globalization cannot be stopped in one single way, in a non-human way. On the border of each of the countries there must be an impassable wall that completely blocks the movement of people and information between them. If just one person moves across the border, if just one bit of information slips through this border, globalization has already begun, and the question is only the pace at which it flows. Yes, indeed, in antiquity, the Middle Ages, when the speed of movement of goods and information was at the level of social organization, on the land at the speed of a horse, on the seas at the speed of sailing ships with an average of 5 to 6 knots, that is also approximately at the speed of a horse of 10 to 12 kilometers per hour, globalization was flowing at one pace. Today, when the intensity of passenger flows and cultural exchange, i.e. the flow of information, has changed, the pace of globalization is different. But the question remains the same. If globalization flows, culture is an information-algorithmic system, then what will arise as a result of the completion of globalization? If it ends before humanity destroys itself, failing to overcome the conflict between the technosphere, magic, and weak innate morality. As a result, a certain common culture should emerge that will unite representatives of all nationalities, all peoples. It will be open to them, and it will, in some way, unite all of humanity. And then the question arises, what kind of culture will it be? After all, if the innate component of our information-algorithmic support is alternativeless, at least if there are no serious genetic lesions that cause sexual perversions and so on, if it is alternativeless, the culture is actually variable. And if globalization flows, it is also variable. What kind of culture do we want at the end of the process of globalization? So again we find ourselves where we started our consideration today of this theme, the typology of cultures. The first attribute is a relation towards creative potential. The second attribute is nraviousness and ethics. Well, and further, all the rest. But in this case, it is not of principal significance, because if tolerance, in the liberal sense, is the acceptance of others as they really are, then in essence, it is a connivance of their aggression, unpreviousness. So, if we orient ourselves on the fact that globalization should end with the creation of culture in which creative potential of everyone is mastered in full measure, and society is nraviously ethically homogeneous, then culture as a whole, and pedagogical subcultures, should be built in such a way that children enter into adolescence possessing will and sovest. And will has to be subordinated to sovest, and creative potential has to develop from that moment in which the child is still in the womb and end with the period when he enters the process of self-education and he consciously, meaningfully, develops and masters his creative potential. This is the only recipe for solving the problems of humanity. This is an integral recipe. This is a panacea against all the troubles that humanity has managed to accumulate, both at the personal level of consideration, when everyone has their own problems that prevent him from living, to global problems that in one way or another affect all people living today and several future generations. If one understands this typology of cultures, then one can accept it, or one cannot accept it because one can stand on the position that sovest is a chimera. This position was taken by Parteigenosse Hitler. Or one can accept it by understanding and can lead one's own life and organize collective activity of people in such a way that this will ultimately lead to the creation of that global culture that will ensure harmony in society and harmony in the civilization biosphere and the possibilities of man's creative activity in all its diversity in the future. If we look into the historical past, then what is the cause of the social catastrophe of 1917? The cause is deeper than Lenin said, because in fact the culture that had taken shape by 1917 stopped the development and deprived Russia of any prospects. That is, if there had been preservation of what was before the start of the First World War, then now Russia as an independent power would not exist. But here there may be objections because songs like that one about the crunch of French bread may affect many, and many may believe that everything was crunchy. But what happened after 1861 was a nightmare, in comparison with which serfdom was simply an idyll. Even though there were some episodes where serfs were whipped in the stables, and there was such a character as D. Saltykova, in the wake of whom a great many were left dead, because she was diagnosed as mentally ill. If you look at how Russia lived until 1917, by and large the village was impoverishing, although more or less large business executives, the so-called kulaks, were taking shape. Where did the impoverishing people go? To cities. Cheap labor force, working conditions not standardized. A 12-hour working day, in reality, at a plant looked like this. Round-the-clock operation of technological equipment, 12 hours not continuously, but every 6 hours. That is, like on a ship watch. Only on a ship the watch is shorter, 4 hours. Imagine that you work every 6 hours, every year, without vacation, without sick leave, under the impact of the technosphere. That is, there is no ventilation, the chemical composition conditioned by technology is unknown, and so on and so forth. The bulk of ordinary people lived, to put it mildly, a hard life, both in the village and in the city. The governing elite had balls, footmen, beauties, and so on. Everything was prepared for them. And what was the consequence? If we look at the Russo-Japanese War, how did we fight? After all, not a single system, except for the Mosin rifle, was the property of the Russian intellect. On the ships we had Cannae guns, Belleville boilers, Bar and Stroud rangefinders, and so on. By the First World War, our shipbuilding absorbed everything. Baltic dreadnoughts, English turbines, Vickers cannons were the basis of the design, Bar and Stroud rangefinders. Battle cruisers of the Ismail type could not be completed during the war because part of the equipment was ordered in Austria-Hungary, since there were no analogues in Russia. Let's say if there had been no World War I, no revolution, in that case the country would have survived until the end of the 30s. What's next? Next is the Russian proverb, the great and stupid are beaten more, and candidates were more than sufficient. I came across some statistics on the internet concerning an exploration of displaced Kulak settlers in Siberia. 0% of them graduated from parish school, 80% could neither read nor write, the remaining 20% were poor literate. That is, someone could read, someone knew how to sign where he was shown. But reading an article on improving agricultural production and ordering something was beyond the educational level that they had. Moreover, those were families that had no money to give their children an education. How was the village organized after serfdom? These were the kulaks, who subordinated the sub-kulaks. The sub-kulaks subordinated the rural poor, farm laborers. The middle-class peasants maintained a perimeter defense alone, or by making temporary alliances. What happened after 1917? The main thing was that universal literacy was provided for everyone in the shortest possible time, and all children received the opportunity to get the education that every one of them was able to master. If one looks at the biographies of prominent figures of Soviet science and technology of the 40s and 50s, then one will see that many of them were born in the middle of nowhere, came to a city, worked at a factory, entered a workers' faculty. After the workers' faculty they entered university or institute, and afterwards they became outstanding figures of domestic science and technology after 20 to 30 years of intensive work. Therefore, one can say that the essence of the era of Stalinism was repressions, abuses, relying on the evidence base in the form of the Gulag Archipelago, written by A. Solzhenitsyn, whose anniversary we are planning to celebrate at the state level next year. But the Gulag Archipelago is a collection of gossip, literaturely processed Gulag camp folklore. This is unreliable information, unreliable statistics. Although it would be foolish to deny the fact of repressions, groundless, harmful repressions, but reducing the essence of that era to this is even more foolish. And the society factually wanted to develop in that direction, where culture would provide the development and opening up of the creative potential of everyone, and where society, in Ravi's ethical terms, would be homogeneous. Therefore, if we turn to the first half of the 80s, then we will see that the majority of the population's claims against the authorities were that the latter were luxuriating, and that they were governing the country ineffectively, and the people expected from Gorbachev that not only party and other nomenclature privileges would be eliminated, but also that the quality of governance towards the country and everything else would sharply increase. What do we have as a result of perestroika and reforms? Factually, we have a degradation in comparison with what we had in the 80s. We have the degradation of both science and technology, because practically everything high-tech that we use, even if the ideas were born in the Soviet Union and Russia, was brought to practical use somewhere abroad. And all this has the labels of some foreign countries and companies whose directorates are located outside of Russia. And what do we have in Russia? I said that lawyers in the juridical governance towards the Russian Federation do not know such words as biocenosis, ecological niche, overfullness of an ecological niche, pan-biospheric objective laws. Only a lazy person, providing he is outside the official circles of power, does not curse the policy of the central bank, because the official circles of power have no pretensions. And of the bureaucracy, both the Soviet era of Khrushchev and further up to Gorbachev and today's bureaucracy, the same is characteristic as was characteristic of the kulaks in the late 1920s and early 1930s. That is, they recognize the right to know nothing and be unable to do anything. It is the duty of their subordinates to know and be able to do, while they are so-called outstanding leaders, but the high quality of their governance for some reason in no way manifests itself in the improvement of the life of the broad masses. But if anyone is to blame for this, then it may be anyone or anything, the crisis, the weather, but not they who govern these or those spheres of activity. That is, factually, in the aspect of nraviousness and ethics, we rolled back to the situation that was characteristic of the Russian Empire until 1917. The only difference is that at that time, the class strata system existed de jure, and now it exists de facto, although juridically everyone is equal in rights and opportunities and so on and so forth. This raises the question on how the country should develop further. The experience of 1917 shows that the path through the catastrophe is unacceptable, because after the statehood collapsed in 1917, it took 2 decades to more or less reach the level that was in 1913. And in fact, only after the final pre-war 5-year period, we managed to reach this level that allowed us to fight off the European Union. The experience of post-Maidan Ukraine also shows what one should not do. Then the question arises, what variants do we have left? All that we have left is that gritting our teeth, we go to the intellectual gym and lift our creative potential concerning the themes of social governance, governance towards the economy, building an effective, working collective, improving the quality of governance. Put it differently, the only possible variant is to go through the law, which requires the mutual correspondence of the system of governance to the object of governance. By what path? The object of governance, society, must cease to correspond to this elitarian system which is not answerable for anything, does not know how to do anything, and does not want to learn anything. If society does not change, then the system is heading towards catastrophe. If society changes, that is, school children study not only according to the program, but master something beyond the program, students conduct a selection of what is nonsense in educational courses and what is not nonsense but necessary in life. In this case, in some time, they will begin to enter the sphere of governance, and they will change both the nature of state governance and governance in the economy, and cadres policy, which will ensure the promotion to positions of governance of different, by nravious ethical type, people. Then the standards of education will change. Culture, thematics of broadcasting, and much more will change. So, this is a very long process, but it carries blago, because everyone can take part in it. And besides, the blago that this process carries is concluded in the fact that the process leads to a guaranteed result, and it leads guaranteedly, because culture is indeed an information-algorithmic system. And culture, if we consider its carriers, is also two-aspected. Because on the one hand, the carriers of culture are people, living organisms. They walk, communicate, do something. And on the other hand, this is the fact that the noosphere is, after all, not an invention of Vernadsky and Teilhard de Chardin, but this is indeed a biofield structure, which carries the reason of the planet, and which contains a segment of humanity. We are all a part of the noosphere, and accordingly every one of us also has the open possibility to act through the noosphere. The noosphere really acts, and its actions are nraviously ethically conditioned, because one of the latest examples shows Vitaly Churkin, Russia's UN ambassador, died in New York. One Ukrainian deputy giggled on this theme. A few days later, he died in a car accident. For some, this is a coincidence, but for others, this is an act of social hygiene, which was conducted from the level of the noosphere. For today, I think that will be it.
Любая система, на наше человечество, как суперсистема, действует очень много факторов. Большое множество. Могут быть какие-то факторы, которые при текущем уровне нравственности не попадают вообще в сферу интересов людей, в принципе,
If we inculcate the nraviousness of slaves, it may become a trap. This is a question of what we are oriented towards. If we are oriented towards the fact that creative potential should be mastered by everyone, that society should be ethically homogeneous, because everyone lives according to their sovest, then this type will gradually expand its representation in the spectrum of statistics. All conditions have been created by now. A variableness allows you to see in life a kind of visual aid on the theme of what you should not be, or, on the contrary, to see visual aids not on the theme of who should be imitated, because imitation is foolish, but on who needs to be understood, in order to reproduce in yourself some good qualities that others have mastered. In this respect, by the way, there was an interesting episode in one of the documentaries on television where they interviewed H. Goering's great-niece. So she is married, and she decides that she needs to sterilize herself, saying, "I had myself sterilized so I would not pass on the blood of a monster." In that interview, she dropped a phrase about the Germans. What kind of nation are we? There is no hero whom one wants to imitate. You see, to reach such an evaluation of the culture of your own people, this is actually not simple. This is not sausages, Oktoberfest. It is much deeper. And we, factually, have worthy people in the historical past. But the liberal culture is aimed not only at preventing us from taking them as models of behavior, but at preventing us from even thinking about them, from taking them as reference points, obviously ethically and in activity. We just need to be what we really are. And therewith, we need to work towards the mastery of all by creative potential, and that creative potential would be subordinated to совесть.
В Советском Союзе была некая такая, среди молодежи, насколько я понимаю, была некая нравственная народность.
No, there wasn't. And if it had existed in the needed quality, then now the Soviet Union would continue to exist as the leader of the civilizational development of humanity. It happened so that people like Zoya and Shura Kosmodemyanskaya did not return from the battlefields of the Great Patriotic War, but people like the father of Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, and many others like him survived the war. Young people before the war were heterogeneous, and after the war they were not homogeneous. After the arms race was imposed, and the Soviet Union could maintain whatever quality it was, the defense status, only on account of restrictions in the quality of life of the majority of the population. Moreover, this was not the essence of economic potential. It was the result of harmful and idiotic governance from the time of Khrushchev and subsequent times until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the desire to walk in Adidas, in jeans, to drive a Mercedes, this was also inherent in a quite wide mass of young people. So they factually got it. But are they happy? This is a debatable question, because in 2000 we celebrated the 20th anniversary of graduation from the university, and someone said, "What did you want?" Just remember, you wanted jeans. You wanted foreign music without restrictions, right? You wanted it. Mercedes? So here it is. If you are unhappy with this, it means that then you dreamed of the wrong thing. So this politics of purpose-oriented depravity, through the mass media, through cinema first of all, since the beginning of the 60s, was carried out with the full connivance and active participants of the USSR KGB, the Ministry of Culture, and many others. Therefore now we are simply reaping the fruits of the fact that our culture was formed unpreviously, and this is again an indicator of what I was talking about. Culture is an information-algorithmic system, and it can be built variably. Building of culture can be oriented towards achieving some objectives or towards achieving other objectives. And unlike state power, power over culture is open to everyone, because state power requires a certain status in the system, but this, actually, requires a certain human status and creative potential. And the noosphere is also open. Direct human communication is open, which in our time is supplemented by the possibilities of communication via the internet with almost the whole world. One needs to just act, but not contemplate how bad everything is and how everything is going in the wrong direction.
Появление новой культуры, которая будет общепринята для всех. И можно ли сказать, что из этого следует то, что все предыдущие культуры, которые мы сейчас имеем на данный момент, они просто будут отмирать?
This again depends on which variant of globalization we choose. Because, one can build globalization in such a way that all national cultures are destroyed and replaced by some unified culture. The West proposes to follow this path. Pidgin English as a universal language of global communication, consumer paradise based on GMOs and everything else, disposable things, and then an ecological crisis. An ecological crisis is a biospheric social crisis. That is, there is a biological component and a socio-cultural component that will kill civilization. Or one can build a culture so that this common integrating culture rises above the national cultures, penetrates them, and allows each of them to develop as it can until they exhaust themselves and integrate into the common culture. You see, again, if we turn to the Soviet Union, to its history, at first there were attempts to forcibly Russify the outskirts. These attempts were characterized as hostile to state politics, and the development of the system of education began, the development on the basis of national languages and everything else that was in the national republics. On this basis, there actually formed a category of highly professional by the standards of that era people who provided the work of medicine, the system of education, industry. Since this is a multinational country, there can be only one language of science. The Russian language became such a language of science. Why? Because firstly, there existed the Russian Empire, and secondly, the Russian language environment was receptive to the achievements of other peoples. This took place also before the revolution. Look into our history. Pay attention to personalities. The names, surnames of prominent figures in science, literature, military affairs, all different people there, and they all considered themselves Russian. In the Soviet times it was the same. Well, imagine the situation that Gurievich speaks only Yiddish and Mikoyan speaks only Armenian. What will happen to the MIG Aircraft Corporation then? It is basically impossible. Therefore, the fact that the Russian language became the national language, the language of science and culture, is not some kind of policy of forced Russification, but because, within the narrow national framework, many creators simply felt cramped, and they could realize their creative potentials only at the pan-Union level. But not everyone could appreciate this, because Mikhail Velichko, after all, joined Moldovan nationalists. If it had not been for the Soviet Union, no one would have known him, no one would have loved him as an actor, and it is unknown whether he would have become an actor in that case. By the way, there are many of those who managed to become what they factually became due to the fact that the Soviet Union was a single, multinational state, and the paths of personal development were not closed to anyone. So if we turn to those times, we will see that it was a fact that the culture in the Soviet Union had to be national in form and socialist in content. If we talk about the socialist content of the culture, then they are these two principles: the mastery of creative potential by everyone, and the Nravious ethical homogeneity of society on the basis of the dictatorship of Soviet. Whether you like Ukrainian borscht or you like Uzbek pilaf, this is your own business which bothers no one else. If you want to sing gypsy songs in a gypsy manner, then sing, but don't parasitize. So the whole thing is visible only after the understanding comes. The understanding that culture is an information-algorithmic system, that it is superstructural in relation to the innate complex of instincts and reflexes, and that its development, especially in the aspect of pedagogy, that is how we conceive, give birth and raise children, has to be coordinated with the genetic program of the development of the organism. But the State Duma believes that they are free from the need to know all this, and they can teach others, but they do not need to be taught. They are already so intelligent. How long will it go on? This depends on how society will change and what contributions it will make. If we talk about the state structure, then the state structure must correspond to society. If society lives by the principle that this has nothing to do with me, you owe me everything, then the same you owe me everything people come to state power. And possessing authority, they put everyone in such a position that everyone really owes them, both in terms of finances and in all other terms.
В отличие от 13 года, мы сейчас умеем все читать, у нас есть интернет, у нас есть у определенного количества людей желание.
Определенное, а большинство, по-моему,
А это не страшно, большинство никогда историю не делало.
These types of processes usually flow with an acceleration. Here the avalanche effect takes place. 20 years ago, the discussion of this theme was possible not at scientific conferences and not in the educational process. And even if it was possible to speak out, this did not find a response. Because, for example, at the Kondratiev readings in 1995, for the first time, it was publicly announced to the official circles of science that the tyranny of usury had shaped the country, and the development of the country required the elimination of the tyranny of usury and the building of a system of interest-free crediting. This was in 1995. Now the MGIMO professor Valentin Yuryevich Katasonov says the same thing. Unfortunately, the national psychology is such that it has not been typical for us to proactively prevent problems over the past 1,000 years. Everything has to be felt through yourself. When it becomes unacceptable, then it goes into the historical past. Nonetheless, one has to bear in mind that Chutchev, in his poem, Russia Cannot Be Understood with the Mind Alone, touched upon a very big secret that he failed to express. He received an education of the European type, which did not allow the expressing of this. For her, no common yardstick was created. This is for the simple reason that the common yardstick of the current era was created by Russia in the past. And now she is creating a yardstick, that is, a criterion of life, of the future era. Therefore, the common yardstick, which was there, it is not acceptable here, because if one looks at what is happening in Europe, the creation of the European Union is an attempt to build a common European statehood. And we, from the time of Ivan the Terrible at a minimum, have had a common to all the peoples multinational statehood, in which there is a place for everyone at all levels, both at the level of power and at the levels below. In an attempt to build a unified, common financial system, the European Union has failed. We have had this very system for a very long time. The question on multiculturalism, the European multiculturalism that took shape in the second half of the 20th century, and the multiculturalism that took shape in Russia over many centuries, since the time of Ivan the Terrible, actually even earlier, are worlds apart. In other words, those problems that the West cannot solve in any way are factually successfully solved in Russia. We are now solving other problems, but we will definitely successfully solve them as well.
Но мы их точно так же благополучно решим.